She was not a wife, she was a daughter. And yet, in the shadow of a wealthy Texas ranch, those lines were erased by a man who believed his power stretched beyond law or morality. What kind of father locks the truth inside wooden walls, silencing an entire household with fear? What kind of community whispers behind closed doors but dares not intervene? This is not just about cattle, money, or land. It is about a secret that tore apart innocence, a silence that lasted years, and a truth too dark to remain buried. By the end of this story, you will learn what really happened in those lawless days. Stay with us until the last second. Subscribe, leave a like, and ring the bell. And tell us in the comments, from which city are you watching this chilling tale? The ranch stood alone against the horizon, its wooden fences stretching across acres of dry, cracked land. The sun burned over Texas with no mercy, painting everything in tones of gold and dust. From a distance, the house looked proud, 2 stories high, whitewashed walls, and a wide porch where rocking chairs creaked in the wind. But the closer one came, the more its silence pressed down like a weight. There were no children's voices, no laughter, only the faint clatter of hooves and the rustle of wind through brittle grass. Travelers rarely passed by this road. The nearest town was miles away, separated by dirt trails that turned to mud in the rain and to choking dust in the summer heat. People said life on the ranch was hard, but those inside its gates never spoke openly of what truly happened there. Outsiders, when invited, were met with polite smiles, tight lips, and eyes that carried unspoken warnings. The community around the ranch was small, scattered across wide tracts of land. Families lived in modest cabins, working cattle, plowing fields, or bartering for supplies whenever the rare wagon of merchants passed through. Poverty was the language most neighbors knew, yet the cattle baron's house stood as an island of wealth. He owned more land than any man in the county, and his cattle fed markets from Austin to San Antonio. His influence reached far beyond the fences of his property. When visitors arrived, they were greeted not by the man himself, but by hired hands. Rough men, their faces browned by sun and work, carried themselves with the stiff silence of those who knew too much but dared say nothing. They tipped their hats, offered water, but their eyes never lingered too long. There was something guarded in their behavior, as though every word was weighed before leaving their mouths. Behind the grand house, another structure stood, a smaller cabin, plain and weathered, used by servants and ranch workers. Women moved quietly between it and the main house, carrying baskets of food, fetching water, or tending laundry on long wooden lines. No one spoke loudly. Conversations were cut short if strangers drew near. It was as though an invisible rule demanded silence at all times. Neighbors sometimes recalled seeing a young woman at the porch of the main house. She had a slender figure, her hair long and tied back, her dress plain despite her father's wealth. She rarely smiled. She did not wave at passing wagons or greet those who delivered supplies. Instead, she kept her eyes lowered, hands folded tightly against her lap. For some, her presence was a ghostly reminder that within the house there was more than cattle and money. There was a secret. The land, the isolation, and the unspoken rules formed a world where truth had little chance to escape. Anyone who stepped too close to the Baron's gates felt it, the strange mix of pride and unease that lingered in the air. Something was wrong, but no one dared to name it. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual inside the ranch. The house smelled faintly of leather, wood polish, and the smoke of an ever-burning fireplace. Portraits of stern ancestors hung on the walls, their painted eyes watching from every angle, as though reminding visitors of the family's long grip on the land. Yet, behind this polished surface, there were cracks that could not be ignored. The young woman was always present but never introduced. She moved quietly around the rooms, arranging dishes, fetching papers, or sitting beside the cattle baron with the posture of someone trained not to defy. Her eyes carried a weight beyond her years, tired, almost hollow, as though life had drained joy from her long before adulthood. Guests whispered among themselves. Was she his daughter, his wife, or something else entirely? No one dared to ask. There were other details, too. The workers on the ranch avoided her gaze. They treated her with respect, but not the kind given to a master's daughter. Their silence held discomfort, as though acknowledging a truth they wished to bury. When she passed by, conversations died instantly and hats were pulled low. It was not reverence, it was shame. Her health raised questions. Neighbors recalled how thin she looked, how her dresses seemed to hang loose on her frame, yet her stomach once appeared swollen in ways that could not be explained by hunger. Rumors stirred, perhaps she had been with child. But whose child? Whispers traveled across the dusty roads, never spoken aloud in town, only shared behind closed doors. Small inconsistencies piled up. A missing record in the church register. A doctor's visit that was never fully explained. A midwife who came and went without a word. When asked, the cattle baron dismissed these events as private matters of his household, no concern of outsiders, and because of his wealth and influence, no one pressed further. Still, suspicion grew. Why was she never seen with friends her age? Why did she never attend church gatherings or town festivals? Why was her life confined within those heavy walls while her father's reputation reached across counties? The isolation of the ranch magnified every odd detail. In a community where families often relied on each other for survival, the silence around this household was striking. Neighbors might trade cattle, share tools, or help mend fences, but when it came to the baron's daughter, they said nothing. Their silence was its own kind of evidence. One evening, a visitor described hearing soft sobs drifting from behind a closed door upstairs. The sound was brief, quickly muffled, followed by the heavy footsteps of the cattle baron himself. Moments later, he emerged smiling as if nothing had happened, offering drinks to his guests. But the visitor never forgot the trembling sound of that voice, hidden in the darkness of the grand house. The cracks in the facade were widening. To those willing to look closely, the signs were no longer subtle. They were warnings. Something within that house defied the natural order of family and morality. And the deeper one looked, the more impossible it became to ignore. To understand the silence that surrounded the ranch, one must first understand the man who ruled it. The cattle baron was not born into wealth. His story began with hardship, as a young cowboy who learned early how to break horses, mend fences, and survive the endless Texas sun. Through grit and ruthless determination, he transformed himself from a poor ranch hand into the wealthiest landowner in the county. His rise was admired, but it was also feared. For it was built not only on hard work but on intimidation and control. In the lawless days after the Civil War, when Texas was rebuilding itself, land was seized by those bold enough to claim it. He was bold and he was merciless. Families too weak to hold their property often sold to him for pennies, while others simply disappeared under circumstances no one dared to question. Soon, his herds stretched across the plains, his cattle branded with a mark recognized from San Antonio to Houston. With wealth came influence, and with influence came silence. The community around him depended on his ranch for survival. He lent money when crops failed, extended credit at his store, and provided work when men had none. But his generosity had a price: loyalty. Those who benefited from his hand learned quickly not to speak ill of him. Even the sheriff, underpaid and weary, looked the other way when the baron's name surfaced in disputes. What mattered was keeping the economy alive, and the cattle baron was the beating heart of it. The church, too, bore its share of complicity. The local pastor, grateful for the donations that rebuilt the chapel roof and kept food on his table, never pressed too deeply into the family's affairs. If questions arose about the daughter, her absences from service, her pale face, her withdrawn demeanor, they were brushed aside with words like illness or fragile constitution. The congregation, most of whom relied on the baron's wages, nodded in quiet agreement. Isolation deepened the secrecy. The ranch lay far from towns where newspapers carried stories of scandal and reform. Here, news traveled slowly, shaped by word of mouth and rumor, and often died before it reached the next county line. What happened behind the walls of that house remained the baron's business, protected by distance and reinforced by fear. Neighbors might sense something was wrong, but their own survival depended on staying silent. A man who spoke too much might find his cattle driven off, his fences mysteriously cut, his family suddenly without work. Women warned their children not to stare too long when they passed the house, and men tipped their hats in uneasy respect whenever the baron rode into town. Generations in the community grew up knowing one truth: the cattle baron's will was law. And when law belongs to one man, justice becomes fragile, easily bent to his command. It was in this climate of power and fear that his daughter's life unfolded, hidden in plain sight, yet unseen by all who could have saved her. The whispers never stopped, though they were spoken only in private corners, never in public. People noticed the patterns, the odd moments that, when taken alone, meant little, but when woven together formed a disturbing picture. The daughter, though young, carried herself like a wife. She accompanied the cattle baron at meals, sat beside him at town meetings, and obeyed his every command without hesitation. When neighbors' wives greeted her, she did not speak of girlish things, no talk of friends, dances, or hopes for marriage. Instead, she spoke only when prompted, her voice flat as though rehearsed. It was as if she had been stripped of youth long before her time. Records raised further doubts. At the county clerk's office, there were strange gaps in documentation. A birth that was never formally recorded. A child who appeared on no census. And then, suddenly, an entry of death, vague and unexplained, as though someone had been erased before the ink dried. Clerks remembered the cattle baron's heavy hand pressing down on the desk, his voice leaving no room for refusal. Doctors, too, seemed to know more than they admitted. One traveling physician recalled being summoned late at night to the ranch, only to find the young woman pale and trembling, her body showing signs of childbirth. Yet by morning there was no baby in sight. The baron dismissed questions with a cold stare and a pouch of coins. The physician never returned, though his silence weighed on him for years. The ranch workers noticed, too. They spoke in fragments, never directly, but their unease was evident. Some had seen the young woman's swollen belly, others the baron's watchful eyes, ensuring no one asked questions. A few swore they heard arguments muffled by thick walls, her voice pleading, his voice commanding. Still, no one intervened. To cross the baron was to risk livelihood, perhaps even life. The daughter's resemblance to her father only deepened suspicion. Her features mirrored his so closely that whispers suggested a truth too cruel to accept, that any child she bore might carry not only his name, but his blood in the most forbidden way. Such talk was dangerous, and yet it spread like wildfire in the minds of those who saw too much. Even church records carried contradictions. A baptism prepared but never performed. A wedding spoken of in hushed tones but never witnessed by the community. Neighbors asked themselves, was there a ceremony hidden behind closed doors, one that defied both law and morality? The possibility lingered like a dark cloud over every interaction with the family. The puzzle pieces did not yet form a full picture, but the outlines were clear enough to terrify. The cattle baron's power was absolute, his secrets buried beneath layers of silence. Yet the cracks were widening. Documents missing, rumors spreading, and eyes watching closer than ever before. For the first time, it seemed possible that the truth, whatever it was, might one day emerge from the shadows. And when it did, it would not just expose a family's shame. It would force the entire community to reckon with the silence that allowed it to grow. The deeper people looked, the harder the walls of silence became. Anyone who dared to ask questions about the young woman was met with cold stares or firm refusals. The cattle baron controlled not only his household but the community around him, and no one wanted to be seen as stepping out of line. Neighbors, when pressed, would shrug and change the subject. Some muttered that it was not their business, while others, with uneasy eyes, admitted that they had families to feed. Speaking out against the most powerful man in the county was unthinkable. To do so was to invite ruin. Fences could be cut, cattle could vanish, debts could be called in overnight. Everyone knew that the cattle baron did not forgive betrayal. The few who attempted to confront him directly quickly learned their place. One storekeeper, after making a careless remark about the young woman, found himself boycotted by ranch workers. Within weeks, his shelves stood bare, his debts unpaid. He left town quietly, taking his family with him, leaving behind only whispers of what he might have uncovered. Even the law proved weak in the face of the baron's power. The sheriff, who owed both his election and his salary to the cattle trade, looked the other way. When asked about the situation, he replied with words as hollow as an empty barn. That family's affairs are private. Behind closed doors, he admitted to friends that his hands were tied. He had no evidence, and no jury would dare convict a man so influential. Inside the ranch, the resistance was even stronger. The young woman herself avoided direct contact with outsiders. If someone tried to speak to her, she lowered her gaze, her lips pressing shut as though fear itself sealed them. On the rare occasions when she seemed ready to answer, the cattle baron appeared, his presence enough to silence any word she might have spoken. His control was absolute, maintained not with affection, but with intimidation and the unspoken threat of consequences. Rumors grew louder, but proof remained elusive. Every document seemed carefully hidden, every witness silenced by fear or bribery. A few ranch hands who left the property carried stories, but their accounts were scattered, inconsistent, and often dismissed as bitterness from former employees. Without something solid, no one could act. The church offered no refuge. Parishioners whispered their suspicions during gatherings, yet when the pastor was asked to intervene, he shook his head. "I cannot accuse a man without evidence," he said, though his trembling voice betrayed the fear beneath his words. The offering plates filled each Sunday with the baron's money, and the chapel lights stayed lit. This resistance only deepened the sense of dread. The truth was there, just out of reach, but every attempt to seize it was crushed beneath the weight of the baron's influence. Outsiders who visited left with a gnawing unease, convinced that something unspeakable lived within the walls of the house, yet powerless to tear it open. It was as though the community itself was trapped, held hostage by fear and dependence. The ranch loomed not just as a source of wealth, but as a fortress protecting a secret too dark to face. And until someone broke the silence, that secret remained untouchable, hidden in plain sight. The first break in the silence came not from officials or neighbors, but from those who had once lived under the baron's roof. A former ranch hand, long gone from Texas, returned years later and spoke in whispers to a trusted friend. He told of nights when he heard muffled cries from upstairs, of a girl's voice begging for mercy, and of doors locked so tightly that even servants could not enter. His story spread quietly through town, carried like smoke that could not be contained. Then came the midwife. She was old by the time she spoke, her hands shaking as she revealed the truth she had carried for decades. She recalled being summoned in the dead of night, ushered through the back door of the ranch house. Upstairs, she found the young woman in labor, her father watching from the shadows, his eyes cold and unyielding. The child was born, but by dawn it had vanished. "I never knew if that baby lived or died," she confessed, her voice breaking. "All I knew was that the girl's tears never stopped." Her testimony matched the rumors that had haunted the community for years. Others came forward, hesitantly at first. A neighbor swore he saw the young woman's belly swell and then disappear within months, though no marriage had taken place. Another claimed he had seen the baron pay off the local doctor, who arrived with a grim face and left with a heavy purse. Documents began to surface as well. A church ledger, long thought lost, was found in the dusty back of a cupboard. It contained an entry that had been crossed out so heavily the ink had bled through the page. But beneath the scratches, faint letters revealed a baptism prepared for a child who was never seen again. A county clerk, near the end of his life, admitted that he had altered records under pressure, erasing names and shifting dates at the cattle baron's command. "He told me it was for the good of the family," the clerk whispered, "but I knew it was for the good of his reputation." Even among the ranch workers, cracks appeared. One man who had kept silent for years finally revealed what he had seen. The baron and the young woman seated at a table, their roles indistinguishable from husband and wife. He remembered her eyes, empty and resigned, and the baron's hand resting possessively on hers. "It wasn't right," he muttered, "but none of us had the courage to stop him." Together, these voices painted a chilling picture. What once were only suspicions now formed a pattern too clear to dismiss. Witnesses, records, and whispered confessions all pointed toward the same dark truth. The cattle baron had claimed his own daughter as something more, forcing her into a role no child should ever endure. The evidence was not yet enough for the law, but it was enough for the community. The silence that had once protected the baron was beginning to crumble. The question was no longer if the truth would come out, but when. The truth, long buried beneath silence and fear, finally clawed its way into daylight. It did not come through rumor or whispers this time. It came through undeniable proof. A young man, claiming to be the Baron's grandson, arrived in the county courthouse with documents that shook the entire community. He carried a letter written years before by the daughter herself, hidden in a Bible and passed down through trusted hands. The words, faded and trembling, revealed the horror she had endured. "I was born a daughter," the letter read, "but forced to live as a wife. My child is not my shame, it is his." The confession was devastating, its authenticity confirmed by handwriting experts who compared it with other notes and receipts signed by her over the years. But the letter alone was not the only evidence. Alongside it came medical records, preserved by a doctor who had fled the county but kept copies out of guilt. The records described childbirths, injuries, and treatments that no unmarried young woman of her standing should ever have required. And then the final piece, blood. The young man who brought the letter had undergone tests matching his DNA against living relatives of the cattle baron. The results confirmed what many had feared but never dared to say out loud. He was not only the baron's grandson, he was also his son. The scandal, spoken for decades only in shadows, was now carved in science, undeniable and irreversible. The revelation hit the community like a thunderclap. Neighbors who had kept silent out of fear now realized their silence had allowed the unimaginable to continue. The church, once complicit, could not hide behind its hymns any longer. Parishioners demanded answers, and the pastor, pale and trembling, admitted that he had long suspected the truth but had been too afraid to speak. The cattle baron himself could no longer deny what had been revealed. His empire of silence crumbled as testimony after testimony was read in the courtroom. Former ranch workers, freed from fear by the weight of evidence, stood and described what they had seen. The locked doors, the cries at night, the controlling hand of a father who blurred the line between blood and marriage. When confronted directly, the old man sat rigid in his chair, his face carved with stone-like pride. "I gave her everything," he said coldly. "Food, shelter, a life better than any of you could offer." But his words, meant to justify, only condemned him further. The community no longer saw a provider, they saw a predator cloaked in wealth and influence. The revelation shattered more than a reputation. It broke the unspoken contract of silence that had bound the county for generations. For the first time, people admitted openly what they had known in their hearts, that the cattle baron's empire was not built solely on land and cattle, but on fear, manipulation, and a secret so dark it stained everyone who had looked the other way. There was no undoing what had been revealed. The law could finally act, not on whispers or suspicions, but on facts, testimony, and science. And with that, the story shifted from rumor to history, its truth forever branded into the memory of the community. The courthouse was filled to the brim on the day the trial began. Men who once tipped their hats in silence now leaned forward in their seats, waiting to hear justice spoken aloud. Women, some with trembling hands clutching handkerchiefs, whispered prayers not only for the victims, but for the reckoning they had long been denied. For decades, the cattle baron had walked into town like an untouchable king. Now he entered the courtroom shackled, his once proud figure diminished under the weight of his crimes. The prosecution laid out the case with precision, the letter written by the daughter, the medical records preserved by the doctor who could no longer live with his silence. The DNA evidence, irrefutable and scientific, proving beyond all doubt that the child she bore was both son and grandson to the baron. Witness after witness came forward, former workers, neighbors, even the old midwife. Their testimonies, once scattered like broken pieces, now formed a clear and devastating mosaic of abuse, coercion, and silence. The defense tried to argue that the daughter had consented, that no law had been broken in the privacy of the household. But the jury could not accept such reasoning. Consent given under fear, control, and dependency was no consent at all, and even those who once defended the baron's generosity, his loans, his jobs, his donations to the church, now saw them for what they were: tools of control, chains that kept an entire community bound. The trial lasted weeks, but the outcome was clear long before the verdict was read. When the foreman of the jury rose and declared the Baron guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted, not with cheers, but with a heavy silence. It was the silence of people finally facing their own complicity, realizing that their fear and dependence had allowed darkness to fester unchecked. The sentence was severe, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For a man who once commanded entire counties, it was a fate worse than death. He left the courtroom with his head held high, refusing to show remorse, but his empire was already crumbling. Ranch hands abandoned his land, cattle were sold off to cover legal debts, and the grand house that once stood as a symbol of pride became a decaying monument to disgrace. Yet the consequences extended far beyond him. The sheriff, who had looked the other way, resigned in shame. The pastor, pressured by his congregation, confessed his failures from the pulpit, begging forgiveness for placing fear above morality. Families who had once whispered now spoke openly, warning their children of the dangers of silence. The daughter's memory, once locked away, became the heart of the story. Her suffering forced the state to reconsider its laws, strengthening protections for women, children, and victims of abuse. The case was written into legal records, studied by scholars, and used as an example of how power could twist justice when left unchecked. The Baron's downfall was not only his own. It was a judgment on a society that had chosen survival over truth, comfort over courage. The trial made clear that silence had its price and that the community had paid it for far too long. In the years that followed the trial, the Baron's once mighty ranch slipped into silence. The fences rotted, the barns collapsed, and the great house stood empty, its windows dark, its doors nailed shut. Neighbors passed it on their way to town, whispering not of wealth, but of the curse of pride and silence. Children who once feared the Baron now dared each other to step onto the porch, as if crossing into the ruins of a legend. The daughter did not live long after her suffering ended. Those who knew her said her spirit had been broken long before the Baron was led away in chains. But her story did not die with her. It lived on through her child, who grew into adulthood marked by the weight of his origin, yet determined to carve a life beyond shame. Though burdened by the truth of his blood, he became the living proof of resilience, refusing to let the sins of his father and grandfather define him. The community itself changed. The trial forced people to reckon with their silence. No longer could they hide behind the excuse of fear or dependence. Meetings were held, laws were discussed, and new voices began to rise, voices demanding that never again should one man's power silence an entire county. Women, especially, found strength in the tragedy. They spoke more boldly, sought greater protection, and demanded that their daughters never endure what the Baron's child had faced. The church, once complicit, sought redemption by becoming a place of advocacy. Pastors preached sermons not only of forgiveness, but of vigilance, reminding their congregations that morality meant nothing if it bent under the weight of wealth. The sheriff's office, restructured and held to stricter oversight, promised transparency and accountability. At the state level, reforms were introduced. Laws regarding consent, guardianship, and abuse of authority were strengthened, influenced directly by the case that had shocked Texas. What had once been hidden behind walls now served as a warning for generations. The Baron's downfall became more than a family tragedy. It became a catalyst for change. Yet, for all the reforms and progress, the haunting truth remained. None of it had come soon enough for the young woman who lived her life in silence. Her fate stood as a reminder of the cost of fear, of what happens when communities look away rather than confront the darkness in their midst. Standing before the ruins of the ranch, one could feel the weight of that history pressing against the wind. The fields that once fed cattle now grew wild with weeds. The grand porch, where she once sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, sagged beneath time and decay. And the question remained for anyone who stopped to look. How many secrets still linger, hidden in homes where silence reigns stronger than truth? Her story teaches us that evil does not always wear a mask of violence. It often hides behind respectability, wealth, and influence, and it thrives when people choose silence over courage. The cattle baron believed he could control his daughter, his family, and even his community. But in the end, it was the truth that controlled his legacy. And so, to this day, her memory asks us one question. When we see injustice, will we look away or will we speak?